For substitute HB127, local land use amendments, Representative Jeremy Peterson. This bill was heard in political subdivisions with a vote of 903.
Representative Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. This bill, first substitute HB 127, is the great granddaddy of all bills related to this topic. It basically concludes a journey that we began a few years ago, and we are now finally arriving at our policy destination. What it does is it creates an exemption for homeowners or owners of property between a single family and a fourplex that is a pre-existing home and exempts them from city enforcement of current building codes. Back in 2008, the state adopted a new window egress building code that called for a much larger window opening than exists in many of our pre-existing homes. And so the bill says that if you are a landlord or a homeowner living in the home, whether you live in a city or a county, or whether that property is conforming or non-conforming in the zoning in which it resides, that a city cannot compel you to cut into the foundation of your home to create a larger window opening if that bedroom was up to code at the time that it was created. And that's what this bill does.
Thank you. Discussion to the bill. Representative Fred Cox.
Thank you. Will the sponsor yield to a question?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Go ahead.
The items that are changing in the actual building code, have they been run past the Utah Code Council?
No, they have not. This bill is a piece of legislative prerogative. To understand the story in this, representatives, this began back in 2011, or I should say it began shortly after the new window egress rules were adopted in 2008. Cities began to enforce this policy and began to ask owners to expand the windows in their basements opportunistically, and they typically would take advantage of landlords. Sometimes tenants will have a grievance with their landlord, and so tenants would invite city inspectors into the property to take a look at the windows that existed in the building. The cities would then compel the owner to install those new windows at the cost of the property owner, and became an unfair burden to those individuals. So in 2011, a bill was run by the Senate which exempted landlords who owned non-conforming property from being compelled to make these changes. That passed unanimously. It sailed through the House and the Senate. In 2012, we recognized that code change did not show up in Title 15A, which is where our building officials go to as a reference for these kind of changes. So we copied and pasted that language into Title 15A. In 2012, I ran that bill, and some of us in here might remember that discussion. So finally, this bill comes to us and it basically expands our existing policy to say if that policy is good for a landlord, then it ought to be good for an owner-occupant. And it ought to be good for somebody who lives in a city or a county, or regardless of the zone that they live in. And so this has not been run by the Utah Building Code Commission, nor do I believe that it ought to be. And so
just want to make a comment. This body and the senators voted last year with a resolution that building code amendments should be run past the Building Code Commission. It includes plumbers and building officials and architects and engineers and framers, and it has a wide variety. I believe that's a good policy to go through. I am also concerned on the extent of building code that is being added to other portions of the law, which was not the intent when we had the discussion in 2012. I understand what the good sponsor is trying to do, And I do believe that there's currently some provisions in code that may be able to be helpful. But at this point, I still have that concern that we're making changes to the code without even throwing them out just to get feedback. Whether we get their approval or not, I think it would be wise to get their comments and advice. Thank you.
Further discussion. Representative Fossen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Will the sponsor yield to a question?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does this have any impact on our current fire code, where the smaller windows are more difficult to offer egress?
This policy does not change anything about our existing rules on basement egress. What we're doing here is expanding the number of homes and the number of owners that this would apply to. In the bill that was run in 2012, that was written by the Salt Lake County Fire Marshal, and his input was, he basically wrote that bill for us. So it does not affect buildings that are being constructed, but buildings that already exist, where bedrooms already previously exist in those structures.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem.
Further discussion. Representative Draxler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. Will the sponsor yield?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Representative, has the League of Cities and Towns taken a position on your bill?
Yes, the League of Cities and Towns actually had a lot of input in the writing of this bill. It actually, they approached me on the initial draft, and that's why we have a first substitute.
Thank you.
Further discussion. Seeing no further lights, Representative Peterson for summation.
I'd just like to appreciate your support on this bill. It treats owners of property fairly and equitably, and applies this policy to them to to preserve some of our older structures and prevent them from structural damage by cutting into their foundations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem.
Voting is open on first substitute House Bill 127. The voting will be closed. First substitute House Bill 127, having received 62 yea votes and 6 nay votes, passes the House and will be transmitted to the Senate for its consideration.